Hey everyone. Today in this lecture, we're going to talk about the Euthyphro Argument. So this is from the Morality and Religion day of the course, but I'm trying to pare this down to what I think you really need to know and what it's really important to know. And what I think it's most important for you to know is the Euthyphro Argument. So I will still send out the lecture slides that have a bit more information about morality and religion and how you might think they are connected, but in this lecture, I really want to focus just on the Euthyphro Argument, because the Euthyphro Argument is meant to show that moral rules can't be basically defined as just whatever God or gods wants us to do. So one view, one answer to the question, what makes moral claims true, is to say God makes moral claims true. And this is a version of moral realism. So remember last lecture we talked about meta-ethics and said that what the different answers for what makes moral claims true. You could say nothing, you could say opinion, you could say society, or you could say the universe. And one way to get more specific on that last answer, instead of just saying the universe, which is super vague, you say God specifically makes moral claims true. And that view is called, or sometimes called, divine command theory. And so divine command theory is the view that what's morally good or morally right is whatever God commands us to do. And what's morally bad or morally wrong is whatever God forbids us from doing. So this means X, whatever X is, fill in X with lying, giving to charity, sitting down sometimes, whatever. X is right if God commands it, and X is wrong if God forbids it, whatever X is. And so the Euthyphro Argument is meant to target this view. The Euthyphro Argument is meant to show that the divine command theory is false. And the way the argument goes is it starts with a dilemma. So remember, we talked about false dilemmas as a fallacy, and we talked about different valid argument structures that use dilemmas, where a dilemma is an or statement that gives you two options. The Euthyphro Argument starts with what's called the Euthyphro Dilemma. And the Euthyphro Dilemma asks, when something is right, let's say it's giving to charity, maybe it's listening to your parents, maybe it's not torturing innocent people, whatever. Pick something that you think is right, plug that in for X here. X is just a variable holding the place. Is X right because God commands us to do X? Or does God command us to do X because X is right? So the Euthyphro Dilemma assumes that if there's this connection where whatever God commands is right and whatever God forbids is wrong, then there's a reason for that. There's an explanation there. So either something is right because God commands it, or God commands it because it's right. Those are the two options. This connection must have an explanation. Either God's command makes something right, or something is right, and therefore, because it's right, God decides to command it. Those are the two options. Either God's command makes something right, or God sees that something is right and then commands it. Those are the two choices. Now, given these two options, the Euthyphro Argument, so the argument's supposed to show that morality can't depend on God, because one of these two options must be true, but neither option is going to work, basically. So the conclusion must be that morality doesn't depend on God in this way, and that the divine command theory is false. That's the conclusion of the argument. So we've got our two options, right? We've got option one, God commands us to do X because X is right, or option two, X is right because God commands us to do it. So, the argument goes like this. Suppose option one is right. Suppose that God commands us to do X because X is right. in that case, X was right before God ever commanded it. The only reason God commanded us to do X was because X was already right. Because that's what option 1 says. Option 1 just says God commands us to do X because X is right. God commands us to obey our parents because obeying your parents is morally correct, morally right. Or God commands us not to lie because not lying is morally good, so lying is morally bad. That's just what option 1 says. That the reason God commanded us to do this thing, whatever it is because it's right. So then that means that being right, not lying, giving to charity, not torturing innocent people, listening to your parents, following the law, whatever it is, whatever we're looking at, whatever moral claim we're trying to make, that thing being right must be independent of God's command. It would have been right even if God didn't command it, because it was right before God commanded it. So that means that morality really isn't based on God's commands. It's not based on God. Things are morally right or morally wrong before God commands or forbids anything. Even without any commands from God, these things are still morally right and morally wrong. But that's what option 1 says. If God only makes the command because it's morally right, that means it was already morally right. And so God's command doesn't do any work in explaining where morality comes from or why something's morally right or wrong. So God can't be the basis. If option 1 is true, then God can't be the basis for morality. God can't do any explanatory work for why there are any moral truths, because all God did on this picture was see the moral truths with God omniscience or all-knowing or whatever feature God uses to know the moral truths. God sees the moral truths and then commands us to follow them. God sees that it's morally right for us to do something and therefore commands us to do it. So if option 1 is correct, then God is not what makes moral claims true. God is not the basis for morality. God is not the thing that makes something morally right or morally wrong. So if God doesn't make anything morally right or morally wrong, then we're back to the other options from the previous lecture we looked at. It's society, the universe, nothing, personal opinion, something like that. But it's not God if option 1 is true. Because option 1 says God sees the things that are already morally right and then makes commands. So if we want to keep divine command theory and say that God is the basis for morality and that whatever God commands is morally right, then that leaves us with option 2. And remember, option 2 says that something's morally right because God commands it. God commands something, and that command makes it morally right. So that means X is not right or wrong before God commands it. Before God makes the command on the option 2 picture, before God makes the command, nothing is right or wrong, right? Because if things were already right or wrong, that would be option 1. And we already looked at that option. So option 2 says that nothing's right or wrong yet. God makes some commands, and then whatever God commanded is now morally right. And whatever God forbid is now morally wrong. But since there was no right and wrong before God made the commands, that means God could have commanded anything. God could have commanded whatever, and it would have been morally right because there's no right or wrong yet. To be morally right on this option just means to be what God commanded. So God could have commanded lying and stealing. God could have commanded torturing innocent people. God could have forbidden charity and taking care of your family. God could have forbidden feeding your own children, for example. God's commands were arbitrary on this picture. There was no right and wrong yet, and then God made commands that made things right or wrong. But those commands could have been anything. So the fact that God happened to say, lying is forbidden and saving a drowning child when you walk by the lake is commanded. Like the fact that these things are what God chose to be right and wrong, it's arbitrary. It could have been anything, according to the Euthyphro Argument. So it could have been anything, which means God's commands were arbitrary, since nothing was right or wrong yet. God could have commanded anything, and he wouldn't have been wrong to do so. No matter what God had commanded, it would have been fine, because there was no wrong answer. There was no right and wrong yet, so there's no correct set of commands to make. So no matter what commands God had made, they would have been fine. And that's what would have been right. If God had commanded torture, torture would have been morally right. So God's commands are arbitrary. But making up arbitrary rules and punishing people who don't follow your arbitrary rules, that's not morally good. That's bad. Making arbitrary choices, arbitrary rules, and then punishing people who don't follow them is not a morally good thing to do. So if God did that, if God made up arbitrary rules and then punished people who didn't obey those rules, then God is morally imperfect. God did something that is morally bad. But if God is the basis for morality, if God is the entity that determines what's right and wrong, if God is what the thing that makes moral claims true and false, then God shouldn't be morally imperfect, the Euthyphro Argument says. God can't be morally imperfect because God is the basis for all of morality. So God being morally imperfect isn't an option. By definition, often, God is said to be all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-good, meaning God can do anything, God can know everything, and God is morally perfect. That's sort of, in the history of Western philosophy, that's sort of a common definition for God. That's basically the definition used by sort of St. Anselm and Thomas Aquinas and sort of Catholic Christian philosophers. It's roughly the definition used by Maimonides and other Jewish philosophers. It's basically the definition used by Avicenna and other Islamic philosophers in the Islamic Golden Age. So, at least in the Abrahamic religions, that's the sort of definition of God that is being used, that God, by definition, has to be morally perfect. So if God is morally imperfect, that's a huge problem. God, by definition, on these views, can't be morally imperfect. But if we take option 2 here, that something's right because God commands it, then God is morally imperfect because God has to have made arbitrary commands and then punished people who didn't follow them. So if we take option 2, if we say things are right because God commanded them, then we have to say that God is morally imperfect. Or so the Euthyphro Argument goes. But God isn't morally imperfect. That can't be right. That's a mistake. So option 2 must be false. Option 2 forces us to say that God is imperfect and God is not imperfect. Either God is perfect or God doesn't exist. Those are the two choices, according to historical views about God in the Abrahamic religions in Western philosophy. So that means option 2 is just false. If you assume that God made commands and that those commands make things right, if you assume that things are right solely because God commanded them, then you are forced to conclude that God is morally imperfect. But God is not morally imperfect, so we must reject option 2 that says that things are right because God commanded them. So option 2 must be wrong. But then that only leaves us with option 1. We had 2 options. Things are right because God commanded them, or God commanded them because they're right. If we say things are right because God commanded them, we reach a false conclusion. And so the correct answer must be God commanded things because they're right. That has to be the correct answer. Option 1, that something is right, or that something is right and therefore God commanded it. That God commanded things because they were right. That's option 1. That must be true. That must be the correct option. That must be the right answer to the Euthyphro Dilemma. But option 1, we already looked at. Option 1 says that morality really isn't based on God. God saw what was already morally right and then made those commands in line with what was morally right. So morality isn't really based on God, then, according to the Euthyphro argument. The Euthyphro argument concludes that something other than God makes moral claims true or false. That even if there is a God, which maybe you think there is, maybe you think there isn't, doesn't matter for the purposes of this argument. The argument says, if there is a God, that God cannot be the basis for morality, for moral claims being true or false. Because either things are right because God commands them, or God commands them because things are right. And it can't be the case that things are right because God commands them. Therefore, God commands things because they're right, but that means they're already right, independent of God, and so morality must be independent of God. Morality is separate and distinct and does not depend on God for its truth. A moral claim, whether it's lying is wrong, charity is good, you ought to save the drowning child when you walk by the lake, all these moral claims are true independent of God. So God doesn't do any work in explaining moral truths. That's the conclusion of the Euthyphro argument. And so there may be parts of the argument that you object to. There have been several objections in the last 2,500 years since it was first written down. But there are also a lot of people who think, a lot of philosophers over the last couple thousand years, who have thought that it conclusively shows that morality and religion must be separate, such that whether or not you believe in God should be irrelevant to whether or not you're a moral realist, whether or not you think there are moral truths, whether or not you think there are moral obligations or not. And so that's the Euthyphro argument. So that's it for this lecture. That's the Euthyphro argument. If you are curious and want to go into more information, I encourage you to look at the lecture slides. I encourage you to email me if you have any questions or you want more information. I am happy to talk about philosophy. It's the thing I've chosen to do for a living. So if you have any questions, please let me know. I'll be happy to answer them. Stay safe out there.